Hello, my name is Daniel Olsen, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at Brigham Young University. It is an honor to have been asked by the organizing committee to serve as the keynote speaker for this, the 10th annual Symposium for Pilgrimage Studies held annually at William and Mary. I congratulate my colleagues at William and Mary for creating a community of scholars and for establishing a symposium that has had such staying power, centered on a subject which I'm passionate about. I'm grateful to be able to wake up every morning and say to myself, I get to study pilgrimage today and get paid to do it. I, with each of you, lament the fact that we cannot be gathered together in person due to the continuation of the COVID-19 pandemic. While for the introverted among us, myself included, doing conferences via Zoom takes away some of the angst involved in having to engage in small talk with strangers and sometimes even friends. There is something to be said about gathering together to engage in deeper discussions about the weightier matters concerning the topics and fields of study we love, as opposed to limiting our discussions to a short question and answer session in a chat box, as will occur at this symposium. Indeed, it is through gathering together in person that we create a deeper and more meaningful community of belonging, both academically and personally, and develop the research and personal bonds that make us co-academics as pilgrims, or conversely, co-pilgrims as academics, as we collectively journey together seeking to better understand the socio-religious phenomenon of pilgrimage. We all hope that for the 11th annual Symposium for Pilgrimage Studies, we can continue this community building in person. Being asked to be a keynote speaker at any conference, let alone this symposium, is a deep privilege, and in many ways work affirming, in that someone has recognized your research as being of value and has argued its significance, as well as the significance of you as a scholar in person, to others in order to get you, rather than another more qualified and probably better looking individual, to be the keynote speaker. However, being asked to be a keynote speaker can also be anxiety inducing, in that a keynote speaker is responsible for not only setting the basic tone and tenor of a gathering such as this, but also, as it is articulated on one professional speaking coach's website, takes us on a journey, makes us look at something in a new way, and whose speech stays with us long after the event is over. My concern here is that what I say today will be somewhat underwhelming. The concepts of what constitute globalization and pilgrimage, I imagine, are quite familiar to most of you watching this video. And from that perspective, I am not sure that anything I say in this keynote speech will either be groundbreaking or stay with you long after this symposium is over. However, if anything, I hope that my brief remarks today will help this video audience think a little differently about the ways in which pilgrimage works and how it's changing in today's modern world as I examine some of the interconnections between globalization and pilgrimage. If I can grossly generalize for a moment before delving into my talk, in my opinion, much of the recent research on pilgrimage has been mostly reductionist in nature, with a heavy focus on the microscale. While pilgrimage as a formal or informal activity is a global phenomenon found in the majority of the world's faith or cultural traditions, often our emphasis as researchers is placed either on pilgrimage to and at individual sites or on the individual pilgrim experience. Both of these foci fitting within particular historical geographical contexts through pure description and or storytelling at the individual level. For some reason, many pilgrimage scholars tend to be a bit reticent to discuss the macro-scale causal mechanisms that facilitate pilgrim mobilities that would better give credence to the underlying reasons of why and how pilgrimage takes place, or to work on developing meso-level theories such as communitas, liminality, and rites of passage that have both theoretical and practical staying power to help us understand pilgrimage better across faith traditions. Maybe this is because of the fractured and socio-culturally contingent nature of pilgrimage that makes it difficult to develop catch-all models that explain all the theological, motivational, processual, and ritual variations inherent in pilgrimage. As such, there is a need to move beyond the privileging of micro individual experiences through N=1 case studies towards a better understanding of the macro scale structures that either facilitate or inhibit pilgrimage travel, such as studying the nature of globalization and pilgrimage as they relate to the themes of, for example, political economy, macroeconomics and mass consumption, geopolitical and supranational structures, and the structure of interconnectedness. In other words, pilgrimage scholars need to go beyond the horizontal movement of pilgrims to investigate the vertical links that situate pilgrims in sacred places within the context of a global whole. While I do not necessarily focus on the structural elements of globalization in this keynote presentation, I do wish to scale up my discussion of globalization and pilgrimage, and in the context of this conference, talk about the changing nature of pilgrimage in a globalizing and post-secular world. In doing so, I wish to draw upon some of my own work, as well as the work of others, on various topics and ideas relating to religious mobilities in today's world, and, based upon my disciplinary leanings, approach globalization and its influence on pilgrimage from a broadly geographical perspective. To begin, I will discuss what globalization is, look briefly at two of its historical forms, and then discuss glocalization. Then I turn to look at pilgrimage, its changing usage in the modern world, and the rise of post-secularism. Then, in honor of the 10th anniversary of this symposium, I turn attention to the main theme of the symposium and examine 10 ways in which pilgrimage travel has fundamentally changed due to globalization, including the democratization of pilgrimage, changes in the sacred laws of hospitality, the increasing medicalization of pilgrimage, pilgrims as an unwanted guest, technology and the pilgrimage experience, the overcommodification and monetization of pilgrimage, the segmenting of pilgrimage and tourism, pilgrimage as spectacle and play, transplanted pilgrimages, and pilgrimage as a sustainable practice, before concluding. As academics, we like to define things. It is kind of our default setting when writing papers or giving presentations, even if our audience already knows much about the topic under consideration. Maybe it is because at a subconscious level or through indoctrination at graduate school, we adhere to the idiom that is often attributed to the French Enlightenment writer, historian, and philosopher Voltaire. If you wish to converse with me, define your terms. I think that everyone listening to this video is familiar with the concept of, or at least the term, globalization. The term itself is commonly attributed to Theodore Levitt, who used it in his paper entitled The Globalization of Markets that appeared in the Harvard Business Review in 1983. However, globalization is what I call a fuzzy term, in that we know what globalization is as a concept and a defining aspect of contemporary societies, but may find it difficult to define globalization, particularly when it can be considered its own separate process, as well as a part of the processes of internationalization, liberalization, universalization, and westernization. As such, globalization is a contested term with no one accepted definition. Elsewhere, I have defined globalization as the development of an increasingly borderless world where flows and exchanges of people, goods, money, ideas, and technologies between countries, cultures, and societies eventually leads to a more standardized, interconnected, and globally conscientious world. This increasingly borderless or transplanetary world has been brought about in part by advances in communication and transportation technologies, as well as the neoliberal economic and political policies that are meant to reduce the friction of these flows and exchanges through removing, or at least limiting, barriers to this movement, barriers such as government, politico-economic interference, and international borders. This reduction of frictional movement, or cross-country smoothing, has led to the development of new relational geographies, power geometries, and what geographers refer to as time-space compression or time-space convergence, where transportation and communication technologies have both metaphorically and literally compressed time and space, leading to nation-state economies being subsumed by the global economy, and where speed supersedes or conquers established geopolitical representations and the material conditions they rely upon, thereby reducing the significance of place as a political and cultural differentiating principle. While globalization as a social science concept has a very short history and is a relative newcomer to the body of theories that make up the social sciences, the processes inherent within globalization itself, which processes include financial deregulation, the reduction of costs related to technological change and innovation, and changes in economic organization and production forms, are not modern post-World War II phenomena. Indeed, manifestations of globalization can be seen throughout most of human history. This can be observed through a comparison of what scholars refer to as weak globalization versus strong globalization. In the contemporary globalization literature, the distinction between weak globalization and strong globalization tends to be based on the degree to which trans-territorial organizations can steer and control the economic, cultural, social, and political life of nation states. Where nation states march lock in step to the mandates of transnational organizations over the most fundamental economic, political, social, and cultural matters. In other words, globalization in both these forms leads to the rise and spread of neoliberalism. However, from a historical perspective, we can also distinguish between weak and strong globalization based on its geographic reach or influence, the territorial extent to which disparate or geographically separate cultures were brought together under these same processes. For example, the Mongolian, Roman, and Ottoman empires, the Christian Crusades, the development of the Silk Road, and European colonization are examples of instrumental organizations, events, and infrastructural improvements that led to early forms of weak or regional forms of globalization. Since the 1970s, however, we have seen a rise of strong globalization, wherein regional forms of globalization have been subsumed by a one world global enterprise, wherein there are few, if any, places in the world that have not been influenced by the processes of globalization with varying intensities. As Peter Beyer notes, if modernity or modernization involves the process of all places eventually becoming modern, globalization spatializes it. This diffusion of modernity has intensified interactions between distant world regions. As a result, rapid change, whether technological, economic, or cultural in nature, has led to cultural acculturation, hybridization, and syncretism becoming more commonplace, and new core periphery relationships have arisen, particularly in the cases where the spatialization of modernization has included various others, whether this exclusion has taken place on a regional and/or racial basis. This rapid change is for many a desired outcome, particularly from those in international development studies who believe that the spread of modernism leads to all boats rising, thereby guaranteeing future equality between have and have-not countries. However, the effects of this intensity of interaction and change has not necessarily led to all boats rising. Indeed, anti or counter-globalist movements focus primarily on the economic inequalities that globalization exacerbates, as well as the loss of state autonomy, has led to a retrenchment from globalization in many global regions along social justice and nationalistic lines. As well, anti-globalist proponents contest the globalization process in terms of its influence on the lives, livelihoods, and identities of people at regional and local scales. This scalar acknowledgement of the influence of the global on the local has led to the rise of the neologism glocalization, first introduced into the social science lexicon by Roland Robertson, which term describes the fact that the global and the local are deeply intertwined and mutually constituted. What this means is that rather than globalization leading to a broad, all-encompassing cultural homogeneity, globalization affects various areas at different scales differently, with the end result being unique and diverse outcomes in different geographic areas. While there is no denying that the global interpenetrates the local and vice versa, and that the imperialistic ambitions of nations, corporations, organizations, and other entities and their desire, indeed their need, to impose themselves on various geographic ideas is real, each region or locality either consciously or unconsciously reacts to these globalization efforts differently in ways that lead to the local becoming a particularization of the global, where the local retains social forms that are indigenously conceived, controlled, and comparatively rich in distinctive substantive content. In other words, globalization makes places similar, but not the same. So what does all this have to do with pilgrimage, or journeys to a distant sacred goal for historically religious purposes, which is at the thematic heart of this symposium? While globalization affects the local, The local also affects the global, and there is no better example of this than religion. As Luke Carrington notes, religion, and hence pilgrimage, has long been a driving force in the process of globalization. To put it more forcefully, Reza Aslan argues that no single force can be said to have a greater impact on propelling globalization forward than religion, which has always sought to spread its message. This can be seen through the use of terms like Islamic globalization and Catholic globalization that describe how these faith communities have utilized the structures of globalization at various times and scales to spread their faiths in order to create a globalized spiritual solidarity within their faith communities, which spread in solidarity was facilitated by pilgrimage and sacred site creation. However, since the focus of this presentation is to understand how globalization has influenced the phenomenon of pilgrimage, I wish to first examine the influence of globalization on religion and religious identity in our modern era, before turning to look at its influence on pilgrimage. With the rise of strong globalization in the 1970s, some scholars noted that the spread of capitalism was increasingly tied to the extension of science, technology, market rationality, and other associated organizational principles. Seeing this trend, these scholars argue that religion, as a strong influencer of public policy, would eventually fall out of favor with the global population in lieu of a politics and economics of consumerism as the dominant cultural ethos. This shift in global ethos would, in turn, lead to religion becoming antiquated and eventually disappearing from the public and private sphere due to its lack of personal and communal influence. However, this was not the case. Yes, the influence of religion in the public sphere seemed to have waned in places such as Europe, but the full global secularization of religion ended up being geographically limited, with some world regions actually seeing an increase in religious adherence and a resurgence in the influence of religion in the public realm. The fact that religion has seen a resurgence in the public consciousness in many places has led some scholars to suggest that we now live in a post-secular world. Post-secularity is often invoked to refer to the desecularization of societies and the return of religion to international affairs, albeit with religion still being viewed as a most awkward element from the past by modern enlightened reasoning. But post-secularity seems to be more than just the resurgence of religion, the death of secularism, and the resurrection of the religious. Within a reappraisal of the role of religion in Western societies by the social sciences, John Milbank argues that the idea of the secular within post-secular modern society does not stand in stark contrast to the sacred through an emancipation from theology, but rather has always been a part of theology, being constituted in relation to theology. As such, modernity, in which secularism is a dominant narrative, may best be understood as an experimentation phase with the secular, rather than a clear break from the sacred. In other words, post-secular modernity involves playing with interchangeable sacred-secular combinations. I think that the key word that describes post-secular modernity, then, is experimentation, which also implies individualization. As Francois Gauthier et al. Argue, consumer societies further the individualization process of modernity by redefining life and society as arenas of choice, rather than the transmission of traditions and belongings. This cultural deregulation has led to new possibilities within the religion field, as manifested in how spirituality is becoming increasingly separated from organized or institutionalized religion. This separation comes about as a growing percentage of people seek meaning and meaning-making through less institutionally bound and more personalized manifestations of religion that also offer access to transcendental human concerns. Indeed, the spiritual marketplace has opened up new forms of pilgrimage-like travel, such as spiritual tourism and New Age tourism, and is demonstrated clearly in the presence of non-Catholics and people of no faith on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, who walk this established pilgrimage path for religious and/or spiritual purposes. We can also include virtual pilgrimages to this list of pilgrimage-like travel, where participants forego the physicality inherent in traditional pilgrimage while still seeking a pilgrim experience. This experimentation has therefore led to a shift in how pilgrimage is defined. If we follow Alan Marinus's view that pilgrimage as any journey, or is any journey undertaken by a person in quest of a place or a state that he or she believes to embody a valued ideal, then secularization has in many ways robbed pilgrimage of its symbolic, mystical, and religious qualities. At issue for me here, though, is that if modernity is an experimentation phase between the sacred and the secular, then post-secular modernity also becomes liquid, in that personal identities that were once bounded by religion and communal structures are now fluid, permeable, and changeable at any moment based on objects, products, and or philosophies that are consumed in the name of connecting to a person's inner self. This liquefaction of personal and communal identities due to precarious uncertainty, short-term planning, instant gratification, the weakening of institutions, ephemeral relationships, struggles to manage risk, volatile consumerist identities, the collapse of viable communities, and the speeding up of social life has led to Zygmunt Bauman to suggest that the tourist is the modern successor of the traditional pilgrim. As a tourist is a systematic seeker of diversity, difference, and novelty. Tourists experiment. However, in many ways, religion acts as a counterbalance to this liquidity, in that there are several ways in which a person can escape from daily life to find their authentic self. However, many people still choose to use religious institutions and their related tangible and intangible heritage as a template for spiritual growth. This is seen in the aforementioned Camino de Santiago, where non-Catholics and those with no faith utilize the religious infrastructure of the Camino as an organizational tool in their search for meaning. And even though sacred religious sites are inundated with a variety of visitors with different motivations and expectations of experience, brought about in part by transportation advances in the global tourism industry, pilgrimage destinations continue to maintain their distinctiveness due to their unique and original historical political contexts, and as such provide to people a pluralization of religious spaces within which this experimentation can take place. Everything I've discussed so far sets the context for the main focus of this presentation, how pilgrimage in our time has changed due to the influences of globalization. Some of the changes discussed here are grounded in the realities of a globalizing world, while others may be speculative, projectional, and forward-looking in nature. And in many ways, these 10 influences of globalization on modern pilgrimage are interrelated. Because of time, I'll only touch upon these 10 ways briefly. The first way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is what I have referred to elsewhere as the democratization of pilgrimage, after Hugh DeSantis's work on the democratization of travel. While pilgrimage is one of the oldest forms of and motivations for human mobility, historically, pilgrimage has not been open to people from all walks of life. For much of the world's history, pilgrimage and travel in general has been a socially exclusive activity, wherein those who participated in such travels tended to be the upper elites within a society rather than laypersons, in part because of its dangers and the costs of travel, as well as subsistence living responsibilities that left little time for less wealthy individuals to engage in long-distance pilgrimaging. However, in modern times, cheaper and faster transportation has democratized pilgrimage, meaning that more people have access to and can afford, and thus subsequently engage in, traditional pilgrimage travel. Indeed, pilgrimage travel has become safer, shorter, and is often not as physically demanding due to these transportation efficiencies. These increasing numbers can be seen, for example, in numbers provided by the United Nations World Tourism Organization, who estimate that between 300 to 600 million people visit religious sites every year. The popularization of pilgrimage can also be seen in the increasing numbers of people who perform the Hajj. Pre-1950, the number of pilgrims attending the Hajj rarely went above 100,000. But today, Hajj authorities have had to limit the number of pilgrims attending the Hajj through forcing potential pilgrims to purchase Hajj visas due to inadequate infrastructure. At its 2012 peak, approximately 3.18 million pilgrims participated in the Hajj. At other religious sites around the world, too many tourists and pilgrims have led to site managers limiting the number of visitors, in some cases including pilgrims, who come to these sites because of wear and tear and other types of physical damage. The second way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is through changes in the sacred laws of hospitality. Providing hospitality to strangers as a sacred obligation is rooted in early human history, where the dangers of pre-modern travel necessitated prescriptions and proscriptions around appropriate contact with strangers and alien cultures. particularly regarding both protection of and the reciprocity between strangers. The view of hospitality as commandment or as a covenant responsibility in the pre-modern world became more pronounced when informed by religion rooted in obligations to deity. The covenants and rules regarding pre-modern hospitality can be found in the sacred scriptures of the three Abrahamic religions, in Buddhist and Shinto philosophy, and also in Roman and Greek mythology. Within these covenants and rules, hospitality towards strangers was unconditional. Taking a stranger into one's home and taking legal responsibility for them was not based on monetary reward, but rather because of the command from God to take care of strangers, and because at some point the host might become the guest. However, in the modern era, the idea of unconditional hospitality has all but disappeared. With an ever-growing and expanding tourism system, with record-breaking pre-COVID-19 numbers of people crossing international borders, and growing concerns regarding risk and safety within the travel industry, the host-guest relationship in our day has become highly commodified, politicized, and scripted. Indeed, hospitality is now often conditional, given to strangers and guests if they are able to pay for the services provided to them. This is even the case where it is altruistically and even theologically appropriate and right to help pilgrims as they engage in their formal or informal pilgrimage endeavors, as those who seek to help pilgrims must also pay taxes and have a livelihood. As such, while globalization has democratized pilgrimage travel, it has eroded the host-guest relationship. Consider, in the book of Genesis, Abraham had a moral and religious obligation to host the three strangers or messengers that God sent to him. I wonder how Abraham would react today if he was asked to host 10,000 people a day, even if he had the money and resources to do so. It is hard to get to know and to love, protect, and care for overwhelming numbers of people, regardless of the desire to be unconditionally hospitable as per God's commands, particularly where mobile strangers and others are viewed with increasing suspicion. The third way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is through the increasing medicalization of pilgrimage. While religion and medicine have a long and intertwined history, today religion has been subsumed by medicine, where religion as both the explanatory and healing factor in people's lives has been overtaken by scientific medical practices. This is evidenced by the power exerted by governmental and medical authorities to shut down religious pilgrimage sites and cancel mass religious events during the COVID-19 pandemic. As Gary Ferngren argues, even spirituality has come to be viewed within a therapeutic framework, one in which counselors replace pastors, and the language becomes one of developing a healthy physical and spiritual lifestyle and restoring one's harmony with nature rather than one's harmony with deity. This medicalization of pilgrimage, however, is not necessarily a byproduct of the COVID-19 pandemic. For several decades, the international community has overseen the medicalization of the Hajj over concerns that the pilgrimage event was a chronic super spreader event. A cholera pandemic in the 1860s, which originated in India and was spread by pilgrims who traveled to Mecca, resulted not only in the spread of cholera to other countries around the world, but also the death of 15,000 Hajj pilgrims during the Hajj. As such, European countries enforced stringent European standard sanitary and medical practices and regulations on the Hajj management, including the forced vaccination of Hajj participants, quarantining practices, and pilgrim surveillance. Concerns over mass religious gatherings as super spreader events have now extended to pilgrimage events in Europe and India. While tourism and pilgrimage travel will continue post-COVID-19, many academics and social commentators have argued that this travel should be more sustainable, suggesting several policies that are designed and enacted to limit long-haul travel. However, the continued expansion of globalized transportation networks and pent-up pilgrimage demand will lead to continued concerns by government officials and medical experts regarding mass religious events in the future, possibly leading to continued and expanded medical oversight and interventions at pilgrimage events. The fourth way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is the pilgrim as unwanted guest. As just discussed, the medicalization of pilgrimage will probably continue apace, not just due to the rise of COVID-19 variants, but also as a preventative measure against future pandemics where infectious diseases spread through travel. Considering that mass religious events, like tourism more generally, were viewed as COVID-19 super spreader events, would it be too much of a stretch to state that in the same way that tourists, as potential carriers of disease, may be viewed with wariness as viral threats post-COVID-19, pilgrims will also be viewed as potential vectors of disease through the same lenses of suspicion? In fact, this has already happened in part, albeit during the COVID-19 pandemic. Every year during Rosh Hashanah, or the Jewish New Year, followers of the Breslov Hasidic Jewish sect travel from Belarus to Ukraine to pray at the grave of Reb Nachman, the movement's founder, who died there in 1810. And in September 2020, due to a spike in COVID-19 related cases, the Ukraine government banned foreigners from entering the country. However, hoping that the ban would not apply to religious pilgrims, 2,000 Hasidic pilgrims showed up at the Belarus-Ukraine border. However, they were refused entry, in part because some pilgrims who had made it to the Ukraine before the border closed were found to be infected with the COVID-19 virus, leading to fears about the spread of the virus by pilgrims. Unfortunately, instead of returning home, a miscommunication led many of the pilgrims to believe that they would eventually be allowed entry into Ukraine. And so they waited in the in-between zone between the Belarus and Ukraine border in makeshift tents and endured many rainy days. Because the waiting pilgrims did not have enough money, water, or kosher food with them, the Belarusian Red Cross Society was called in to provide assistance. Eventually, one of the Ukraine's Interior Ministry officials publicly stated, "Ukraine has shut its borders to foreigners, and no exclusions will be made for the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox pilgrims. It is getting colder, and we suggest that they go home," which the Hasidic pilgrims eventually did. I cannot help but wonder if the medicalization of pilgrimage, combined with other instances of pilgrims being denied entrance into foreign countries, and the canceling of mass religious events, and the enforced closure of religious sites due to the potential of pilgrims being disease vectors, will continue in an ever-globalizing world. And if pilgrims leave a country for pilgrimage purposes and an epidemic breaks out at the event, will these pilgrims be allowed to return home, or do they have to quarantine in the country in which the pilgrimage took place? And will governments ban pilgrims from certain countries, particularly those with low vaccination rates, from traveling to mass religious gatherings? Something to consider. The fifth way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is through technology. The interconnection between pilgrimage and technology can be viewed in both a negative and a positive light. Historically, pilgrimage was dangerous. It was physically demanding and emotionally draining. However, while globalization and its associated transportation technologies has made it easier for people to travel to religious pilgrimage sites and participate in faraway religious rituals, it has also decreased the historically physical nature of the pilgrimage experience. Pilgrims are no longer required to walk or take a boat to their sacred destinations, as globalization and technological advancements have created thicker and compressed connections between world locations. The hardships of long-distance pilgrimaging have been minimized, such as in cases where pilgrims choose to use mobility-enhancing technologies such as cars, buses, and bicycles rather than their feet to travel along pilgrimage routes. Also, the emphasis on risk aversion and shifting travel standards and amenity expectations within the hospitality industry has led to the conditions of being on pilgrimage becoming much more comfortable. At the Hajj, for example, wealthier pilgrims can participate in various rituals in the comfort of air-conditioned hotel rooms, while the less wealthy pilgrims endure the heat. Also, while in Portugal a couple of years ago, I remember speaking to a group of pilgrims in the lobby of my hotel room who were walking the Portuguese way of the Camino. During the course of our conversation, one of them commented to me how nice it was to be able to book a van service that would take their heavy luggage to the next hotel so they could walk the Camino unencumbered, thus having a more comfortable pilgrimage experience. Websites, apps, and social media have also led to changes in how people experience pilgrimage. For example, the addictiveness that many people have to small screens can make it difficult for wannabe pilgrims to put their devices down to facilitate spiritual experiences that only occur through mindful engagement with the pilgrimage route, site, and ambient setting, a phenomenon that is outlined well in Kathleen Jenkins' new book, Walking the Way Together, how families connect on the Camino. And with so much information regarding the do's and don'ts of pilgrimage travel along various pilgrimage paths or at religious sites, much of the mystery, the mystique of the unknown, and the spontaneity of the pilgrimage journey has dissipated. However, for some, these same technological and transportation advances can also enhance modern pilgrimage experiences. Information provided to pilgrims via the same websites, apps, and social media channels can reduce much of the risk and anxiety inherent in the pilgrimage process, which may possibly inspire people who are psychocentric or extremely risk-adverse or nervous travelers to participate in pilgrimage travel, as they can now better plan and prepare for their sacred journeys through these mediums. And while virtual pilgrimage does negate the ritual praxis of pious bodies, it does allow immobile people to engage in the pilgrimage process in ways that might not otherwise be possible. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people could choose to participate in the Camino de Santiago virtual challenge. This challenge involved people exercising at home, and for every mile they ran, walked, biked, or swam, they could track how far they travel along the Camino. Also, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints hosted live virtual tours of their religious heritage sites for church members who could not visit during the pandemic. These virtual tours were very popular, with the number of church members participating in these virtual tours outnumbering the number of in-person visitors these religious heritage sites would receive in any given year. These virtual tours allowed church members from around the world who might not otherwise have an opportunity to visit these sites to do so, helping them learn more about their religious faith and heritage. The sixth way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is what I call the over-commodification and monetization of pilgrimage. Commodification refers to the cultural and economic processes through which goods, ideas, people, and services are transformed into objects of economic value, objects that in many cases were formerly non-sellable or non-market things. Indeed, some commentators suggest that there are some things to which assigning a monetary value to something that had not been formally considered in monetary terms should not occur, such as religion, which is a higher order good, because the commodification of these objects corrupt and constitute threats to human autonomy and personhood. Religious commodification can be defined as a set of purposeful acts to convert religious symbols and institutions into marketable and consumable commodities. The problem with religious commodification, however, is that it recontextualizes religious symbols, language, and ideas from their original religious context into commodities. While concerns over the commodification of religion tend to be a Western concern, as material and immaterial religion has been sold in non-Western societies for centuries, the idea of over-commodification comes from questions regarding what aspects of religion should and should not be sold for profit, and who should be selling religious goods for profit. The problem, I think, is not necessarily the selling of religion by religious organizations, because they need a monetary base to survive. I also do not necessarily have a problem with enterprising entrepreneurs using religion for monetary gain. This is the case with the Camino de Santiago challenge that I just mentioned, where pilgrims could more fully participate in this challenge for a modest fee, depending upon the package they wanted to purchase, in order to receive, among other items, the tracking app, a t-shirt, and a medal for completing the Camino route. Rather, for me, the problem is with the over-commodification of religion, or where religious institutions and site managers become more focused on making a profit than on saving souls. For example, Cam Hung et al. Shared a case study where tourists at a Shaolin temple in China became upset because not only were the monks overly aggressive in asking for donations, but also seemed to be spending more time hawking souvenirs than dealing with the spiritual needs of the visitors. With increasing wear and tear on religious sites due to over-pilgrimage, and with most religious sites being self-funding, the need for money to maintain pilgrimage routes and endpoints is great. And as such, there may be a greater emphasis by some religious site managers on the monetary aspects of sacred site management. Even if this emphasis seems strange. to visitors who struggle with this juxtaposition between spirituality, asceticism, and material accumulation. The seventh way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is how pilgrimage and tourism have been utilized and segmented by the tourism industry. With religion being both a supply and demand side aspect of travel for centuries, it makes sense that the modern tourism industry would incorporate religious sites, routes, and ceremonies into their itineraries. However, with an emphasis on hyper-commodification, where advertisers and marketers emphasize minute differences between products so as to create larger and larger numbers of commodities, the tourism industry has been active in identifying different niche markets upon which to capitalize. Initially, noticing the growing numbers of people participating in pilgrimage travel, the tourism industry created the religious tourism market, which focuses on facilitating the movement of people to religious sites. From an industry perspective, pilgrimage falls under this religious tourism moniker. Since then, there has been a splintering of this market to include the spiritual tourism market and the New Age market. However, there is now also a pilgrimage tourism market. The pilgrimage tourism market differs from the religious tourism market in that it is a demand-side market. Sometimes also referred to as faith tourism or faith-based tourism, this market focuses on the believer as tourist, with an emphasis on developing faith-friendly offerings to address consumers' religious sentiments. It will be interesting to see if and how these tourism niche markets fragment even further in the future. The eighth way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is what I call here pilgrimage as spectacle and play. The idea of pilgrimage as spectacle is tied to John Urie's notion of the tourism gaze, which emphasizes the visual nature of tourism, where tourists seek out and consume visual images, as well as the means by which the tourism industry organizes and directs this visual consumption. While many tourists travel to seek authentic experiences and meaning, other tourists, as per Daniel Boorstin, do not, and are satisfied with staged, superficial experiences. With religious culture continuing to be an increasingly important tourism resource in the post-secular modern era, religious pilgrimage has been deconstructed in the eyes of many tourists to just be another event, an attraction, or a spectacle to be gazed at rather than experienced. With this emphasis on the visual, pilgrimages become things or objects to be commodified and marketed to an audience that wants to see pilgrimage in action. For some people, pilgrimage can be seen as ritual as vacation, where pilgrimage is just a type of leisure activity in which they can play with or experiment with in a less deep and meaningful way. As a case in point, BBC Two in the UK has sponsored 3 pilgrimages, one to Rome, one to Santiago, and one to Istanbul, to cater to their reality television market. The Road to Santiago, referred to by one pundit as Celebrity Big Brother with Blisters, is a 3-part series wherein several people with various star power attempt to walk the 800-kilometer pilgrimage route over the Pyrenees towards Santiago. Pilgrimage, The Road to Rome, is also a 3-part series tracing 8 celebrity pilgrims of different belief systems as they walk 1,500 miles in 15 days along their pilgrimage route. And the pilgrimage route to Istanbul series follows 7 celebrities as they start from Belgrade, Serbia, walk through the Balkans before making their way to Istanbul. These shows are replete with intrigue, infighting, complaining, foot pain, and at the end, miraculously, healing and faith finding. People that watch this show can vicariously engage in pilgrimage by watching others do so in a somewhat playful and scripted manner. Again, making pilgrimage in this case something to be seen rather than something in which to participate. This can also be seen in the ways in which many tourists and even pilgrims use sacred sites as a cultural backdrop within which they blend sacred and secular motivations and activities. As one 20-year-old pilgrim explained to Simon Thomas et al. In their study of postmodern pilgrimage at Lourdes, why do we come to Lourdes? That is simple, to pray and to play. The ninth way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is through transplanted pilgrimages. One of the outcomes of globalization has been the intensity of migration flows throughout the world, generally from developing to developed countries. As people migrate from one country to another, they bring with them their religious customs, norms, and values, including pilgrimage rituals and traditions. Carolyn Proroch has suggested that within a North American context, religious migrant groups engage in several strategies to maintain their religious traditions. One of these strategies is to travel back to their ancestral homelands as pilgrims to maintain a connection with their faith community. Another strategy is to either create new or co-opt existing sacroscapes, to transplant former pilgrimage traditions where they're living to sanctify those locations. Examples of this range from the establishment of Protestant summer Bible camps to the building of cathedrals and basilicas complete with relics of martyrs and saints, to the Hare Krishna Holy Festival of Colors, which is performed in various destinations around the United States, to the co-opting of the San Francisco Chinese New Year Parade by Taiwanese Americans to perform religious rituals related to Mazu. While these strategies may seem to lead to the detraditionalizing of sacred spaces, texts, and mobilities, rather, I think these strategies instead lead to the creation of new spatialized ontologies that may involve a renewed reverence for traditional texts, practices, places, and symbols. The 10th way in which pilgrimage has been influenced by globalization is through questioning pilgrimage as a sustainable practice. As I have noted elsewhere, pilgrimage and religious tourism are sometimes viewed as a form of soft tourism that involves more environmentally mindful travel. Indeed, in discussions regarding the negative environmental impacts of tourism, religion and religious travel is rarely, if ever, mentioned. In a book I co-edited with my good colleague and friend Kieran Shindy, we discussed this issue and suggested that pilgrimage travel today is not environmentally sustainable. Pilgrims do not tread softer than tourists, environmentally speaking. One of the case studies in our book was on the Hajj, and how pilgrims at the Hajj produce over 42,000 tons of waste during this pilgrimage event. Both in this case study and another case study about the pilgrimage in India, it was found that both religious leaders and pilgrims felt that it was not their responsibility to clean up the waste that they created during the course of pilgrimage events. Because pilgrimage was a just cause in the eyes of God, either God would take care of the waste or ultimately the local governments would. Doing their part to be more green was not a part of the pilgrim worldview. This is an interesting finding, considering that most religious faiths have articulated theologies related to environmental conservation and stewardship, and that the environmental actions of pilgrims and religious leaders were often in conflict with those theologies. In many cases, pilgrimage routes and destinations suffer from over-pilgrimage, a term I have previously used in this presentation. This term is related to over-tourism as a phenomenon in which the impact of tourism on a destination, or parts thereof, excessively influences the perceived quality of life of its citizens and or the quality of visitors' experiences in a negative way. In the same way, pilgrimage as a mass tourism event can also turn into over-pilgrimage, where resource demands, environmental modification, and solid and liquid waste left behind by pilgrims can hurt the quality of life of residents receiving these pilgrims. This is particularly the case where there is a lack of strong institutional and governance infrastructure to handle the impacts of over-pilgrimage. However, there have been recent attempts by pilgrimage event managers, non-government organizations, and governments at various scales to make pilgrimage more green, which efforts can lead to improved ecologies and peace building. For example, managers of the Hajj are focusing on investing resources, developing technologies, and creating strategies to improve solid waste collection and recycling efforts, as well as food and ritual waste disposal, and also limiting pilgrimage-induced CO2 emissions in major cities. One non-government organization, the European Green Pilgrimage Network, as a faith-led network of pilgrim places, pathways, and cities in Europe, is committed to promoting green or environmentally friendly pilgrimage. Its vision is that pilgrims leave a positive footprint on the earth and that pilgrim places become models of care for the environment. The Interreg European Regional Development Fund, which brings governments together to focus on shared policy issues, is about to complete a 1.18 billion green pilgrimage project that spans the years 2017 to 2022. The purpose of this project was to bring together 6 regions in the United Kingdom, Italy, Norway, Sweden, and Romania to promote the integrated management and development of natural and cultural heritage, with a focus on the sustainable management of pilgrimage tourism resources. Having suggested 10 ways in which pilgrimage has changed in our globalizing world, at this point, I would be keenly interested in hearing your ideas regarding other ways in which you feel globalization has influenced the way pilgrimage is performed today. While this is a video and we cannot discuss your ideas here, as I understand it, the Keynote time slot on Friday, November 12th will be turned into an interactive question and answer session. By interactive, I'm assuming that I sit there and wait until people either ask questions about or comment on the content of this presentation. And since I am deathly afraid that either no one will show up or that some of you will show up and have nothing to discuss, I am asking those of you who are watching this video presentation to come to the keynote session ready to share with me and other symposium participants your ideas on how globalization has changed modern pilgrimage mobilities. What is an 11th idea that we can add to the list here regarding how globalization has changed modern pilgrimage? Come prepared to teach me and your fellow attendees. Concrete examples would be greatly appreciated. I wish to thank again the Symposium Organizing Committee for this opportunity to speak to you about globalization and its influence on modern pilgrimage. Preparing for this keynote talk has really helped me to think about the ways in which pilgrimage travel has evolved due to socio-political and economic changes that have recently taken and will continue to take place at a global scale. Thank you for taking the time to watch this keynote video. I look forward to seeing you online at the symposium.